Alright, settle in. Because if you think galactic diplomacy is all thrilling starship battles and heroic speeches, you've been watching too many holodramas. My name is Krillian, and I'm a Krillian cultural attaché. Which, for the uninitiated, means I spend most of my days observing other species making spectacularly bad decisions, occasionally offering a pithy comment, and then documenting the fallout. Right now, I'm at Omega 7, a diplomatic station that's more chrome and sterile than a freshly sterilized surgical instrument. Another trade summit, another endless parade of species jockeying for position, all while pretending to care about intergalactic harmony. Honestly, it's usually as exciting as watching paint dry on a particularly bland wall. But every now and then, something unexpected happens. Something that reminds me why I put up with the endless droning. The hum of the assembly hall, typically a dull, multi-species murmur, suddenly deepened, vibrating with an almost physical presence. That could only mean one thing. General Cathar of the Thurvac Military Confederation was making his grand entrance. And when I say grand, I mean it in the way an asteroid impact is grand. Cathar was a walking, armored mountain, easily 9 feet of scaled muscle and bristling weaponry. His species, the Thurvac, were legendary, or perhaps infamous, for their physical prowess and their rather direct approach to, well, everything. Each heavy, deliberate step of his clawed feet echoed through the polished hall, a percussive announcement of his arrival that made the very air feel heavy with his presence. I watched, a cynical knot forming in my gut, knowing this summit was about to get significantly less dull. And just like a Thurvac dropping a gravity bomb, Cathar immediately dominated the room. For the better part of the first hour, his booming voice was the only sound that truly mattered. He held forth, gesturing with massive armored gauntlets, on the undeniable superiority of Thurvac military might, their millennia of unbroken conquest, and the weakness inherent in any species that dared to prioritize things like negotiation or mutual understanding. He dismissed diplomacy as the a tactic for those without the courage to simply take what they wanted. Ambassador Phelan, a delicate Xanthari with multiple expressive limbs, twitched nervously, while Director Theron, usually engrossed in his data slate, actually looked up, if only to sigh dramatically. It was a masterclass in aggressive posturing, and frankly, I found it utterly predictable. The other delegates, a colorful menagerie of galactic bureaucracy, reacted with varying degrees of practiced patience. Phelan's clicking sounds, usually a sign of approval or thoughtful processing, became rapid and agitated, indicating profound discomfort. Director Theron, a being of pure, unadulterated administrative apathy, finally just retreated behind the glowing shield of his tablet, feigning an intense focus on some spreadsheet or other. I knew the drill. Most species here had dealt with the Thurvac before. You just let them bluster, nod occasionally, and wait for them to exhaust themselves. It was the galactic equivalent of letting a tantrum-throwing toddler scream it out. Only this toddler could rip a starship apart with its bare hands. My eyes, however, were already drifting towards the main entrance. Something new was about to arrive. And then they entered, the humans. A species so new to the galactic stage, they still felt like an unwritten page in the cosmic encyclopedia. They were small, almost alarmingly so, compared to the average delegate. No natural armor, no impressive claws or fangs, no shimmering scales or intricate chitin. Just soft, vulnerable skin, 2 spindly limbs, and disproportionately large heads. Yet, despite their apparent fragility, they'd integrated into galactic society with bewildering speed. They were everywhere, adapting to everything, asking endless questions. I still hadn't quite figured them out. They were like a particularly persistent invasive species, but with better manners, and an inexplicable fondness for spicy food. The question always was, what exactly was their trick? Leading the human delegation was Lena Thorne. She was even smaller than her companions, barely reaching Cather's knee. Her uniform was simple, utilitarian, and utterly devoid of any embellishment. Her file, which I'd scanned out of professional curiosity, listed her as the Humanity Liaison for Interspecies Conflict Resolution. I'd scoffed internally, of course. Conflict resolution for a species that looked like they'd shatter if you sneeze too hard? It felt like putting a particularly fluffy, harmless pet in charge of a predator containment unit. Still, there was something about her eyes. They were calm, observant, and held a depth I couldn't quite decipher. A flicker of something, perhaps, in the corner of her mouth. So brief I almost imagined it. Cathar, of course, noticed them. His guttural voice, which had momentarily subsided, now boomed with a fresh, incredulous laugh that grated on my auditory sensors. "What is that?" he roared, his massive clawed hands sweeping dismissively in their direction. "Are these the humans I've heard so much about? They look like hatchlings, so small, so soft. Do they even have bones, or are they merely gelatinous sacks of fear?" His words were laced with open contempt, and the other delegates shifted uncomfortably. Even Director Theron winced, though he didn't lower his tablet. Lena Thorne, however, remained utterly unperturbed. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, as if Cathar's insults were nothing more than a particularly loud, buzzing insect. Cathar, clearly emboldened by what he perceived as their meekness, continued his tirade, circling the small human delegation like a particularly aggressive predator. "Look at them," he bellowed, pointing a claw at Lena's arm. "No scales, no chitin, no natural armor plating, no venom sacs, no razor talons, not even a hardened carapace. Their skin is like the tenderest fruit." He made a contemptuous snapping gesture with his thumb and foreclaw. "Their bones, I'm told, are no stronger than those of the Avarian bird people, and those feather brains are too fragile to even survive a strong breeze." The delegates exchanged uneasy glances. Even I felt a flicker of discomfort. It was one thing to dismiss a species. It was another to openly threaten their physical integrity. Yet Lena Thorne's expression remained utterly, unnervingly neutral. Lena Thorne, to her credit, didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't even offer a nervous smile. She simply held Cathar's gaze for a long, silent moment, then turned with a calm, deliberate grace. She walked to her designated seat, a tiny speck against the vastness of the hall, and took her place. Then, without missing a beat, she looked back at the still roaring general. "General Cathar," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly resonant, cutting through his bluster like a laser. "While your observations on human physiology are certainly spirited, I assure you, they are not on the agenda for today's discussion of the Outer Rim Trade Accords. Perhaps we could table them for a later, more appropriate time." Her tone was polite, almost dismissive, as if he were a junior intern who had interrupted an important meeting. Cathar paused, mid-roar, his massive head cocked in confusion. Cathar, clearly unaccustomed to such a calm, bureaucratic deflection, sputtered for a moment before recovering. "Table them?" he rumbled, his voice still laced with a sneer. "These are not observations, human. This is the truth of strength. My people have 10,000 years of warfare, conquest, and dominance to prove it." He thumped his chest with a sound like a distant cannon. Lena, however, merely nodded. "Indeed, General," she replied, her voice still perfectly level, as she adjusted the microphone before her. "An excellent historical context for our discussions on interspecies resource allocation and the long-term economic stability of emerging trade routes." I swear I saw a vein throb on Cathar's scaled forehead. He was expecting a fight, a cowering, a reaction. Not this. Not a calm, polite reframing of his warrior boasts as mere historical data for a trade summit. This was going to be an interesting day. The general, a being whose entire culture revolved around the concept of might makes right, was utterly flummoxed. Lena Thorne, this tiny human, had just taken his boast of 10 millennia of unbroken warfare and, with a straight face, recategorized it as excellent historical context for our discussions on intergalactic economic policy. I saw the muscles in Cathar's jaw clench, his tusks grinding almost imperceptibly. He'd expected a flinch, a stammer, perhaps a tear. Instead, he got a polite nod and a note scribbled on a datapad. Lena even offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a conciliatory smile, though. It was knowing. And Cathar, for all his bulk, didn't seem to know what to do with it. My own eyebrow twitched in amusement. This was far more entertaining than the usual squabbles over mineral rights. Cathar's patience, clearly a finite resource, snapped. His voice, already a thunderous rumble, dropped to a guttural snarl that vibrated through the chrome-plated floor. "You were all," he spat, glaring at the human delegation, A cosmic accident. A biological anomaly with no natural defenses, no strength, no purpose beyond being a nuisance in the galactic order. The temperature in the room plummeted. Even Director Thorne, usually lost in his tablet, looked up with a frown. Ambassador Phelan emitted a series of rapid, distressed clicks, pulling back into its chair, making itself as small as possible. The insult wasn't just directed at Lena. It was a blanket condemnation, a deeply personal species-wide assault. This wasn't diplomacy anymore. This was a prelude to something far uglier, and Lena, incredibly, remained utterly still. A lesser being would have erupted. A more sensible one would have retreated. Lena Thorne, however, merely tilted her head, a thoughtful expression on her face. "General," she began, her voice calm, almost educational. "It's true that humanity is relatively new to the galactic stage. Yet, in just a few short cycles, we've brokered more multi-species trade agreements and signed more non-aggression pacts than some of your allied systems have in centuries." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "Perhaps your assessment of our species, while certainly passionate, is also slightly incomplete." Cathar let out a frustrated grunt, a sound usually reserved for battlefield defeats. His anger was a visible aura, a dark storm brewing around his massive frame. He hated being countered with logic, hated being made to look foolish. My respect for Lena, which had been a tiny spark, was now a steady, growing flame. The general, no longer content with verbal sparring, decided to shift tactics. He pushed himself to his feet, a tower of muscle and armor, easily 9 feet tall. His shadow, vast and menacing, fell over the human delegation. Each heavy step he took towards Lena echoed in the sudden silence of the hall. This was it, the moment I'd been anticipating with a morbid curiosity. Commander Zira, the station's head of security, was no fool. Her hand was already on the grip of her plasma sidearm, her posture rigid, ready to intervene. "General Cathar!" she barked, her voice tight with authority. "Return to your designated seating area immediately. Any further aggression will be met with force." My body tensed, leaning forward in my seat. The air crackled with raw, unbridled threat. Cathar ignored Zira completely. His focus was entirely on Lena, a predatory gleam in his multifaceted eyes. He took another deliberate step, closing the distance until he loomed directly over her, his massive shadow enveloping her small form. "Force?" he sneered, a deep, guttural sound that rattled the crystal water carafes on the tables. "You speak of force, Commander, but what force can you apply against a diplomatic envoy? I simply wish to observe, to test just how fragile your species really is." His tusks, sharp as obsidian blades, seemed to lengthen as he spoke. For scientific purposes, of course. The chilling menace in his voice was undeniable. He wasn't just threatening, he was articulating his intent to inflict harm, openly, brazenly, under the guise of an absurd experiment. And that's when Lena Thorne did something truly unexpected. She looked up at the towering General Cathar, her face still utterly devoid of fear, and a slow, almost gentle smile spread across her lips. "General," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the heavy silence, "are you threatening a diplomatic envoy of the human commonwealth?" Cathar threw his head back and let out a booming laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Threatening? Little human, this is not a threat. This is an observation." His laughter grated on my sensitive Krillian ears, but my gaze was fixed on Lena. That smile. It wasn't gentle at all. It was a calculated, almost predatory thing. I suddenly knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that Lena Thorne was not afraid. Not even a little. Commander Zira, her face a mask of furious frustration, repeated her order, her hand now fully encompassing the grip of her sidearm. "General, I will not warn you again. Return to your seat." Cathar merely waved a dismissive, clawed hand at her, as if swatting away a bothersome insect. "Diplomatic immunity, Commander," he boomed, a smug grin splitting his face. "This is merely a friendly demonstration of Thurvac robust engagement practices." He actually winked. A Thurvac general winking. The audacity was breathtaking. Zira stood frozen, caught between protocol and the obvious, escalating danger. No one could stop Cathar now. Not without sparking a full-blown incident. A diplomatic nightmare far worse than Cathar's petty bullying. And he knew it. He absolutely reveled in it. Then it happened. Cathar, without a word, reached out with his massive, clawed hand. It wasn't a punch, not a slap. It was a flick. A casual, contemptuous flick of his foreclaw aimed directly at Lena Thorne's forehead. The sound was like a sharp crack, shockingly loud in the sudden, absolute silence of the assembly hall. A sound that, for a human, meant one thing. Lena's head snapped back, a small, involuntary gasp escaping her lips. For a horrifying instant, she looked utterly broken. Then, a thin line of crimson bloomed just above her upper lip, tracing a path down her philtrum, before a trickle of blood began to stream from her left nostril. Ambassador Phelan let out a frantic series of clicks. Director Theron dropped his tablet with a clatter. It was a gunshot in a library. The blood, bright red against the pristine white of her uniform, painted a stark, horrifying picture. It ran down her chin, staining the pristine fabric. Cathar, meanwhile, looked absolutely delighted. He pulled his hand back, flexing his mighty claws, a triumphant grin on his face. "Oh dear," he rumbled, his voice laced with mock concern. "Did I break something? Perhaps I was a little too enthusiastic. But you humans are so terribly delicate, aren't you?" He took a step back, surveying his handiwork, clearly expecting tears, screams, or, at the very least, a collapse. My stomach churned with a mixture of disgust and horrified fascination. Lena, however, didn't collapse. She just stood there, blood dripping, her eyes fixed on Cathar. Lena Thorne raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, and wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her thumb. Her gaze never left Cathar's smug face. Her voice, when it came, was still perfectly even, chillingly devoid of pain. "Are you finished, General?" she asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Before Cathar could respond, before anyone could even breathe, Lena reached up with her bloodied hand. She gripped the bridge of her broken nose between her thumb and forefinger. I saw the slight tension in her neck, the barest flicker in her eyes, but her expression remained otherwise impassive. Then, with a sickening, audible sea-crack that echoed through the silent hall, she snapped her nose back into place. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She just took a deep, steadying breath, then looked at Cathar. "Because if you are," she said, her voice now dangerously low, "it's my turn." Cathar's jaw, which had been set in a triumphant sneer, dropped. The delegates gasped. My own breath caught in my throat. The silence in the hall was profound, thick enough to suffocate a Thurvak. Cathar, however, seemed merely confused. His smug grin had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed bewilderment as he stared at Lena Thorne. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his thick skull, trying to process the impossible. A fragile human, not only enduring a broken nose, but resetting it with a casual flick, all while maintaining the composure of a seasoned poker player holding a royal flush. His arrogance was cracking, revealing a raw, dawning concern that was, frankly, glorious to behold. He'd expected tears, or at least a full-body seizure. Not that. My own anticipation was a live wire. What would he do now, this brute, whose entire worldview had just been shattered by a woman a third his size? But Cathar was a creature of habit, and arrogance was a hard habit to break. His confusion quickly curdled into a renewed, desperate anger. He wasn't going to back down. Retreat simply wasn't in his vocabulary. "Clearly," he snarled, his voice a low rumble of impotent fury. "A more thorough lesson is required." His massive clawed hand, the same one that had shattered Lena's nose, began to rise again, moving with a ponderous slowness that bespoke utter certainty. He was reaching for her, again, and in that moment I knew. This was it, the point of no return. Cathar, in his monumental idiocy, had just sealed his own fate. I took a sharp, almost involuntary breath. My eyes locked on Lena, waiting. Lena Thorne, however, was no longer waiting. The diplomatic mask, which had held so perfectly for so long, finally slipped. A smile, slow and cold, spread across her face. It wasn't the polite, deflecting smile of moments before. This was something else entirely. A predator's smile, ancient and utterly chilling. Her eyes, still bleeding slightly at the edges, narrowed to slits, glinting with an intensity I hadn't known humans possessed. She leaned forward, just a fraction, the movement almost imperceptible, yet it shifted the entire dynamic of the room. "General," she said, her voice a soft, almost melodic murmur that cut through the heavy silence. "You are about to make another mistake." And then, in a blink, the hunter became the hunted. The speed was impossible. One moment Lena was seated, smiling her predatory smile. The next, a heavy ceramic coffee mug, previously ignored on the table, was a blur, impacting Cather's face with a sickening crack. He bellowed, a sound more of surprise than pain, stumbling backward, his massive form momentarily off balance. Before he could even register what had happened, Lena was a whirlwind of motion. She vaulted the polished conference table, a feat of athleticism that defied her unassuming frame, landing silently on the other side. My eyes struggled to follow her. Her hand snatched at something on the elaborate centerpiece. A ceremonial fruit knife, no bigger than my thumb, designed for delicate slicing, not combat. She moved like a thought, a blur of intent. Cathar, still reeling from the ceramic mug, bellowed again, trying to regain his footing, his vision momentarily impaired. But Lena was already behind him. I barely saw her move. It was a flash, a shimmer, and then she was there, a small shadow in his immense wake. The fruit knife, glinting wickedly, was no longer a decorative item. With a swift, precise movement that bespoke of practiced, brutal efficiency, she buried the tiny blade into a nerve cluster just above his left elbow. Cathar's roar instantly morphed into a high-pitched shriek, his left arm spasming wildly, then falling limp, useless. "Thurvac physiology," Lena murmured, her voice devoid of emotion. "The primary motor nerve runs surprisingly close to the surface here. Efficient." Cathar, blinded by pain and disbelief, spun, trying to bring his remaining arm to bear. He was a creature of brute force, and his instincts were screaming at him to crush this tiny, infuriating human. But Lena was faster. She stooped, snatched a discarded draconis eating claw, a wicked, three-pronged implement from the floor, and lunged. Before Cathar could complete his turn, she had his good arm, twisting it, her small frame surprisingly strong. With the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a butcher, she used the draconis claw to systematically sever and tear every major tendon in his right shoulder, a series of sickening snaps and wet rips, audible even over Cathar's guttural wails. "We are a species that hunts," she stated, her voice a chilling whisper. "And if we are hunted, we fight back." And then it was over. General Cathar, the apex predator, the boastful warrior, lay sprawled on the polished floor, both arms flopping uselessly, a pathetic, mumbling heap. His mighty roars had devolved into whimpers of pain and sheer, unadulterated terror. Lena Thorne stood over him, her pristine white diplomatic uniform unblemished, save for the trickle of blood still escaping her perfectly reset nose. She breathed steadily, not even winded. My chrono blinked. 45 seconds. From the moment the mug flew to Cathar's ignominious collapse, a mere 45 seconds. The delegates were frozen, statues of disbelief, their eyes wide, jaws agape. My own cynical observations had never prepared me for this. Humanity, it seemed, had a very different definition of fragile. Lena took a deep, steadying breath, wiped another drop of blood from her nostril with a pristine white handkerchief, and then, impossibly, looked around the stunned room. Her gaze settled on the director of the session. "Now," she said, her voice calm and entirely professional, "shall we return to the discussion of Outer Rim trade agreements? I believe Ambassador Phelan had a point regarding the Krillian tariff on refined dilithium." Commander Zira, the security chief, was the first to snap out of it. She rushed forward, her security team finally moving, but not towards Lena. They were heading for the whimpering mass that was Cathar. Zira, however, stopped short of Lena. "Ambassador Thorne," she stammered. Are you all right? Do you require medical attention?" "Medics," having been summoned by Zira's panicked initial call, now rushed in, carefully maneuvering Cathor onto a hover stretcher. He continued to mumble incoherently, his eyes wide with a terror that would likely haunt him for cycles. Lena, meanwhile, simply dabbed her nose again. The delegates, slowly, began to stir, their shock giving way to a profound, almost reverent curiosity. Director Thorne, tablet forgotten, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Lena. "Ambassador Thorne," he asked, his voice hushed, "your negotiation techniques, they are unorthodox. What exactly was that conflict resolution method?" Ambassador Thorne, clicking nervously, echoed the sentiment. Lena merely offered a small, knowing smile. "Just a small demonstration," she replied, "of humanity's unique approach to problem-solving. You see," Lena continued, her voice now calm, pedagogic even, "humans evolved as persistence hunters. No claws, no fangs, no armor. Just endurance, ingenuity, and a very strong drive to protect our own. We adapt. We learn. And when pushed, we remind others that even the smallest, most unassuming creature can be the most dangerous." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the now rapt faces of the delegates, including my own. "And as for my previous profession, before diplomacy," Lena offered another of her small, knowing smiles. "I was a kindergarten teacher. You learn a lot about conflict resolution when you're managing a room full of highly emotional, highly motivated small beings." The hall was silent, a new understanding dawning on every alien face. The meeting, I recall, proceeded with a newfound, respectful, and frankly terrified efficiency.